Morgan Freeman stepped onto the set of The View that day with a single purpose: to say what no one else in Hollywood dared to. The producers thought they knew what they were in for: a legendary actor promoting his latest project, sharing a few nostalgic stories, and maybe offering a soundbite about his long career. But they had no idea what was coming. They underestimated him. And then, everything flipped in a way no one saw coming. Now, picture this: the bright, polished studio of The View. Cameras rolling, the audience clapping right on cue, the host smiling, expecting another routine segment. But the moment Freeman leaned forward, his deep, deliberate voice cutting through the scripted atmosphere, the entire room shifted. "You know, when I was a kid, we didn't see ourselves," he began. His words landed with the weight of a truth long ignored. The hosts, used to steering the narrative, suddenly found themselves in unfamiliar territory. Even Whoopi Goldberg, a veteran of these conversations, looked momentarily caught off guard. "And when we did, we weren't the hero," Freeman continued. "We were the sidekick, the stereotype, the background." The audience, usually buzzing with chatter and laughter, fell silent. This wasn't the conversation they had tuned in for, but it was one they couldn't turn away from. "The problem hasn't disappeared," he went on. "It's just evolved. Hollywood tells the stories it wants to tell, and history, it gets rewritten." His eyes locked onto Sunny Hostin, whose previous comments about Black narratives in media had sparked this very discussion. "You mentioned Black battalions, the soldiers who fought and died for this country. But do you realize how little that story has actually been told?" Hostin opened her mouth, maybe ready to interject, but Freeman simply lifted a hand. Not harshly, not dismissively, just firmly. "No disrespect," he said, his tone calm but unshakable. "But this isn't about one film. It's about a pattern, a system. It's about how we've allowed entire generations to grow up not knowing the full picture of our history." The tension in the room was thick. Joy Behar glanced at the producers, maybe looking for a way to pivot. Alyssa Farah Griffin sat quietly, observing. Sarah Haynes nervously checked her notes, likely wondering how this discussion had veered so far from what was expected. But there was no turning back now. Freeman wasn't finished. Turning his attention to the audience, his voice remained steady. "Movies and television shape how we see ourselves, how we see each other. But when the only stories that get told are filtered through one lens, what happens to the rest of us? What happens to the kid who never sees himself as the hero?" The weight of the moment was undeniable. The applause that followed wasn't the usual polite clapping heard on daytime television. It came from deep, visceral agreement. People weren't just listening, they were feeling every word. Whoopi finally found her voice. "Morgan, you're right," she admitted, nodding slowly. "This is the kind of conversation we need to be having." But even as she spoke, there was an unspoken question hanging in the air. How far would The View let this go? Freeman's expression didn't change. He wasn't looking for approval. He wasn't there to fit into their pre-planned segment. He had started something now, and whether they liked it or not, the conversation had shifted. What no one realized at that moment: this was only the beginning. Because when you challenge the narratives mainstream media protects, there are always consequences. And The View was about to learn that lesson the hard way. The producers believed they could steer the conversation back to safer ground. That was their first mistake. Their second? Underestimating Morgan Freeman. Whoopi Goldberg, usually the most composed, shifted slightly in her seat. Joy Behar, always quick with a quip, forced a half smile. They had handled countless interviews, navigated difficult guests, redirected heated debates. But this was different. "Hollywood has convinced itself it's telling the full story," Freeman continued, his voice calm but unwavering. "But that's the illusion. The stories that get greenlit, the ones that get amplified, fit a certain narrative. And history? It gets rewritten." Behar jumped in, her tone dismissive. "Well, we have plenty of stories about Black history," she said, waving her hand. "I mean, 12 Years a Slave, Selma, Hidden Figures." Freeman let the silence stretch just long enough to make her uncomfortable. Then, with the precision of a man who had spent his life delivering lines that held weight, he responded. "Those are stories about oppression," he said. "They matter. But where are the stories of triumph? Where are the stories where Black men and women are the leaders, the innovators, the people shaping history in ways that don't revolve around suffering? Behar hesitated. Freeman turned to Hostin. You mentioned Black battalions. But how many young people today even know about them? How many students have ever been taught about the Harlem Hellfighters? The men who fought in World War I, sent to the front lines but denied respect when they came home. Hostin blinked. I mean, there have been books, documentaries. Freeman smiled slightly, but there was no humor in it. Books. Documentaries. But not in the mainstream. Not in history classes. Not in the movies that shape how we remember the past. The audience was hanging on every word. Whoopi exhaled. Morgan, I get what you're saying, she said carefully. But isn't it also about what audiences will support? Hollywood is still a business. Freeman cut in smoothly. And who controls what audiences see? Who decides what gets marketed? What gets promoted? Because let me tell you something, people will watch what you give them. If you only serve one kind of story, that's what they'll expect. The audience murmured in agreement. Behar crossed her arms. Okay, but let's not pretend Hollywood hasn't made progress. Look at you, Morgan. You've had an incredible career. If things were as bad as you're saying, would you have become who you are today? Freeman didn't even blink. You don't measure progress by the success of a few, he said. You measure it by opportunity for all. The applause was immediate. But in the control room, the producers had made a decision. The segment had gone off script. The conversation had gone too deep. And they were about to make a fatal mistake. Right as the applause was still echoing, the screen abruptly cut to a commercial break. The timing was unnatural. Abrupt. The audience, mid-clap, looked around confused. Even the host seemed momentarily thrown off. Whoopi glanced toward the camera crew. Joy adjusted her microphone. Sunny flipped through her notes, searching for a transition that wasn't there. Morgan Freeman, however, didn't react. He simply sat back in his chair, watching. He had been in this business long enough to know exactly what had just happened. They were trying to regain control. And in that moment, they proved his entire point.
Hi.
The usual post-show chatter was gone, replaced by hushed discussions and worried glances. Whoopi sat in front of her mirror, rubbing her temples as her phone buzzed with messages. Joy Behar paced the room, occasionally checking social media, while Sunny Hostin sat stiffly, deep in thought. Morgan Freeman, however, was unfazed. He had seen it all before. As he gathered his belongings, a junior producer hesitantly approached him. Mr. Freeman, she said quietly, I just wanted to say thank you for what you said. He nodded, offering her a small smile. Truth has a funny way of making itself heard, no matter who tries to stop it. Outside the studio, reporters were already gathering, eager to get a comment. Cameras flashed, microphones extended. Freeman simply walked past them, his expression unreadable. He had done what he came to do. Meanwhile, ABC executives scrambled for damage control. A carefully worded statement was released. We at The View encourage open and honest discussions, and Mr. Freeman's insights were invaluable. The commercial break was a standard programming decision and not an attempt to silence anyone. Nobody bought it. By the end of the day, major media outlets had picked up the story. Conservative pundits framed it as proof of liberal media suppression. Progressive voices called it an indictment of Hollywood's unwillingness to face hard truths. Celebrities chimed in, some in support, others carefully skirting the issue. But the biggest shift wasn't in the headlines. It was in the people watching at home. Something had changed. Viewers, many of whom had watched The View for years, were seeing it in a new light. The illusion of control, of scripted debates and safe conversations, had been shattered. If they would cut off Morgan Freeman, one of the most respected voices in the industry, who else had they silenced? And that was the real consequence. Not the backlash, not the trending hashtags, not even the network scrambling to contain the fallout. The real consequence was that, for a brief, unscripted moment, someone had pulled back the curtain. And once people saw the strings, they couldn't unsee them.